And we'll get started. I think we'll probably have some more people coming in, but thanks to everybody who is here. We have 5 presentations today. Just looking ahead, we have 5 more, I believe, next Tuesday, and then I think we have 6 next Thursday evening. So thanks again for coming. Rob is going to start us off. His title is Geostatistical Analysis of Gentrification and Homicide in Washington, D.C. So Rob, you can go ahead and get started when you're ready.
All right, so for my capstone project, I've conducted several geostatistical methods to identify spatial relationships between gentrification and homicide in our nation's capital. Washington, D.C. is one of the most gentrified cities in the country. Previous studies describe gentrification as a racial and socioeconomic process in which low-income urban areas are revitalized through heavy investment and infrastructure updates. This often results in wealthy, often college-educated individuals and high-end businesses moving in. Many low-income residents, often without college education, who cannot afford rising costs of living, are displaced and forced to find residence elsewhere. Multiple studies on gentrification in DC describe influx of wealthy white residents into the central wards of the city, with the northwestern wards remaining relatively upper middle class. The southeastern wards have remained mostly low income. Some studies have shown higher concentrations of low-income residents in the southeastern wards. Other studies show that displaced residents in DC have been disproportionately Black in comparison to other racial groups. An increase of Black populations in the low-income southeastern wards, combined with decreased mobility associated with low income, may indicate displacement from the central wards into the southeastern wards. Because of growing or pre-existing wealth in the surrounding counties of Northern Virginia and Southern Maryland, residents pushed out of central DC will need to move east into the low-income wards, or even further east into Prince George's County, Maryland. Although crime rates have fluctuated over the past decade in DC, recent data published by the city indicates that homicide rates have shown a steady increase, especially in the low-income wards. The project goals were to identify spatial autocorrelation and local clustering of gentrification and displacement variables with homicides. Also to compare bivariate spatial relationships between all variables while identifying spatial correlation and local clustering within the study area. And to create temporal map and chart displays to broadly depict gentrification, displacement, and homicide throughout the city. The 2010 census shapefile was used as a starting point for the data preparation, while the 2012 ward shapefile was used as a reference to aggregate the census tract level homicide data for the temporal analysis. The demographic net change data for each census tract was retrieved from a 2000 to 2016 gentrification study. And the DC crime shapefiles from 2008 to 2020 were downloaded from the Open Data DC website. The first data preparation process involved initial setup in ArcGIS Pro, then manual input of demographic net change data from the Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity study into the census tracts layer. The second process involved using Model Builder in ArcGIS Pro to integrate the homicide data layers into fields for homicide totals per year, then identifying outlier tracts using box plots and Geodot. Multiple new layers were created with the removal of outlier tracts and those deemed to be independent of demographic net change. The third process involved aggregating homicide rates per ward, creating temporal line graphs for homicide rates, and creating feature classes for tracts characterized by higher than average gentrification, displacement, and homicide rates throughout the city. The fourth process involved creating an Excel spreadsheet to compare results of different spatial relationships between variables. Univariate Moran's eye involves measuring the global spatial autocorrelation of one variable in a dataset by comparing the variable to a locally averaged or lagged version of the same variable. The process of bivariate Moran's eye measures the spatial correlation between one variable and a spatially lagged version of a second variable within a dataset. Instead of looking at a one-to-one relationship between variables, spatial contiguity is the focus of this approach. Univariate Local Indicator of Spatial Association, or LISA for short, has been implemented to observe localized spatial autocorrelation in different parts of the study area, while bivariate LISA has been used to identify local clustering between different variables. In this type of analysis, the terms high-high, low-low, low-high, and high-low are used to describe a variable and its relationship to a lagged version of the same variable in univariate terms or a lagged version of a different variable in bivariate terms. Using insights gained from these methods, multiple layers have been compiled and reorganized to create a combination of thematic maps and line graphs in ArcGIS Pro to help summarize gentrification, displacement, and homicide in DC. So the map in Figure 1 displays Washington, D.C. with tracts outlined in different colors based on their demographic characteristics or homicide rates. Wards are numbered and outlined in blue, while the low income percentage backdrop provides a broad overview of wealth distribution throughout the city in 2016. As we can see in this map, most of the dark blue low income areas are situated in the southeast. The central and northwest wards of the city have lower percentages of low income residents displayed as yellow tracts. High gentrification tracts are outlined in light green, characterized as tracts with higher than city average net change in white, mid to high income and college educated residents from 2000 to 2016. High displacement tracts are outlined in light orange, characterized as tracts with higher than city average net change in Black, low income, and non-college graduate residents. The red outlined tracts are those with higher than city average homicide rates based on net change in homicides from 2008 to 2020 and homicide totals from 2016 to 2020. High gentrification tracts exist almost exclusively in the central wards of the city, while 82% of the high displacement tracts are located in wards 7 and 8. Additionally, 76% of tracts with higher than average homicide rates are located in wards 7 and 8. At a glance, most spatial overlap has occurred between high displacement and high homicide tracts. The graph in Figure 2 displays homicide totals per year throughout the entire city. And the graph in Figure 3 depicts homicide totals per ward throughout the city. Wards 7 and 8 closely resemble the citywide trend observed in Figure 2 and have experienced overall rising homicide rates since 2013, as well as more homicides than any other ward since 2008. The two tracts labeled with red X's have been removed from the data sets analyzed and described in the remainder of the presentation. These two tracts were identified as either non-residential or a military base. For this slide, I'll be comparing different versions of scatter plots as the figures fade back and forth. The data displayed here and on subsequent slides has been selected from the Excel sheet I created to organize the results for more than 70 variable combinations and several hundred scatter plots and cluster maps archived throughout the study. The ones I have used in this presentation have been selected based on a combination of significance and summary level information that they provide. Figure 4 shows scatter plots with non-gentrification tracts removed, while Figure 5 shows scatter plots with non-gentrification tracts and outlier tracts removed. Scatter plots where the Moran's I value is higher with outliers removed indicates lower reliance on variable-based outliers towards the global outcome. The gentrification and displacement variables in these scatter plots are based on the averaging together of race, income, and education variables to create useful but non-absolute comparative values. For gentrification, three net change variables, white, mid to high income, and college graduates, have been averaged per tract, creating a field of unique values to express approximate gentrification in each tract throughout the city. For displacement, the same averaging technique has been conducted on the three net change variables, Black, low income, and non-college graduates. The upper left scatter plots indicate significant positive spatial autocorrelation between average gentrification variables, while the upper middle scatter plots indicate a similar trend between average displacement variables, but to a lesser degree. The upper right scatter plots indicate significant negative bivariate spatial correlation, which generally indicates that tracts throughout the city that have experienced an increase in gentrification variables have also experienced a decrease in the displacement variables, and vice versa. The lower left scatter plots indicate significant spatial autocorrelation of total homicides from 2016 to 2020, while the lower middle and lower right scatter plots display the bivariate relationships between gentrification and displacement variables as they relate to homicides that occurred from 2016 to 2020, which was directly after the measured gentrification and displacement net change period from 2000 to 2016. Displacement variables show some positive spatial correlation with subsequent homicides, while gentrification variables show some negative spatial correlation with the same homicides. The displacement to homicide combination with a decrease from NGR to OR shows greater reliance on outliers to achieve the global outcome than other variables displayed on the slide. The following slides will showcase individual variables and bivariate combinations that stood out as strong global influencers. On the left, we have white net change, which is the strongest gentrification variable in the study, with lower reliance on outlier tracts, and is stronger than the gentrification variables averaged together. On the right, we have college non-graduate net change, which is the strongest displacement variable in the study, with greater reliance on outlier tracts, and is most similar to displacement variables when averaged together. So here on the left, we have black net change with white net change lagged, which is the strongest bivariate combination of individual displacement and gentrification variables observed, with no change between NGR and OR, and weaker than gentrification and displacement variables averaged together. On the right, we have college non-graduate net change with homicides from 2016 to 2020 lagged, which is the strongest bivariate combination of individual displacement and homicide variables, with moderate reliance on outlier tracts and stronger than displacement, average, and homicide variables. While observing Moran's eye value of different variables and variable combinations illuminated some global trends in the data sets, Lisa sheds light on where spatial clusters occurred throughout the city at different significance levels. These graphics spatially depict clusters of gentrification, displacement, and homicide at different significance levels within the NGR dataset. Cluster maps in figure 10 depicted at the significance level of p equals 0.05 shows a broad interpretation of which spatial clusters constitute significance, while the false discovery rate, or FDR, in figure 11 is a much more conservative depiction. FDR is based on an automated process that uses the overall attribute values of each variable to generate a unique variable-based significance value associated with local clustering. The FDR significance level of each variable generally fell between p equals 0.01 and 0.001. Maps on the left show average gentrification and average displacement clustering individually. Average gentrification shows high clustering in the center of the city, while average displacement shows high clustering predominantly in the southeast wards. The center maps provide a bivariate view of clustering in which low-high and high-low values are of greater interest. The center of the city may be described as a place where many tracts that have experienced a decrease in low-income, Black, non-college educated individuals are surrounded and influenced by tracts that have experienced an increase in mid to high income, white, college educated individuals, and vice versa. In the southeastern wards, the opposite seems to be the case. Many tracts that have experienced an increase in low-income, Black, non-college educated individuals are surrounded and influenced by tracts that have experienced a decrease in mid to high income, white, college educated individuals, and vice versa. The two maps on the right show the relationship between average displacement from 2000 to 2016 and total subsequent homicides from 2016 to 2020, allowing a potential space-time correlation inference to be drawn from the temporal relationship between these variables. The bottom right map supports this notion, indicating a strong outward clustering influence from individual tracts with high displacement characteristics towards the contiguous surrounding tracts with high homicide counts in the years after. The strongest clustering gentrification variable was net change in college graduates, with the most tracts remaining after the FDR filter was applied. This was greater than the gentrification average variable and much greater at FDR significance than white and mid to high income net change variables. This would indicate that although the three gentrification variables showed overlapping clusters in the center of the city, net change in college graduates likely has the most influence on gentrification variables averaged together in terms of local clustering. Comparatively, the displacement variable showed less clustering than gentrification variables, especially under the FDR filter. The strongest clustering displacement variable was net change in Black residents. Net change in college non-graduates yielded a few less FDR tracts, while net change in low-income residents yielded no FDR tracts for the cluster analysis. Interestingly, the average displacement variable yielded stronger clustering than any of the individual displacement variables. The bivariate relationship between net change in college non-graduates and college graduates as the lag variable was the strongest bivariate clustering combination and most similar to the bivariate clustering between average displacement and average gentrification as the lag variable. Although net change in college non-graduates and homicide totals from 2016 to 2020 was the only significant displacement to homicide bivariate combination in the global analysis, All three individual displacement variables showed significant bivariate clustering with homicides lagged. In conclusion, the study supports notions from previous literature describing gentrification in DC as an influx of mid to high income, college-educated white residents into the center of the city. The results from the study also suggest the likelihood that low-income Black residents, many without higher education, have been displaced to the southeastwards. Although direct statistical correlation has not been measured in the study, the temporal nature of spatial clustering between time-lag variables of displacement from 2000 to 2016 and homicides from 2016 to 2020 suggests the possibility that gentrification-induced displacement has influenced homicide rates in these neighborhoods to some degree. By achieving the three main project goals, the study has met its purpose of identifying spatial relationships between gentrification and homicides throughout DC, leaving the door open for further studies to be conducted using similar variables in other urban centers that have experienced heavy gentrification. All right, so this concludes my presentation. I'll now be accepting any questions or feedback.
Great job, Rob.
Thank you.
If you want to just type your questions in the chat and then Rob can read them out loud before answering, that way they're captured in the recording. I'll go first while people are typing. You and I were chatting before the presentation started, and you had mentioned contacting the city and seeing if there was a way to present your information somewhere. What would be ideal for that in your mind? How would you like to have that conversation with them?
Well, honestly, I want to reach out again, just because I was trying to organize it before and get some kind of venue set up. And this was definitely one of the ones that I thought would be most important, because it would be addressing the people that could, have the power to make a difference, addressing them directly. I think maybe at a town hall meeting of some sort. I know they're doing a lot of that virtually right now. So it would just be a matter of just getting a hold of the right person, I think, maybe at a different time, and just having better luck that way. Because I did reach out to multiple council members of the Urban Revitalization Committee, and I heard nothing back. So I had to move on from there, unfortunately.
Great, thanks. It looks like Anthony has a question.
Yep. All right, says, thanks, Rob. What are some of the other covariates you'd like to have to enrich this analysis further? Are there data sources you wish you had at hand? Okay, so I'll address the second question first. I think just with the timing of this study, with the 10-year census kind of in progress as I was working on the study, I didn't have the 2020 census available, but it should be available this year. So I think it'd be really interesting to kind of readdress a lot of the variables I used and kind of work in the updated data, so we could get a more clear picture of what's going on, or what's going on right now as opposed to a couple years ago, because gentrification is definitely it's a complicated process, and it's kind of different in different cities. It seems to pan out differently, just through my the background research that I conducted. So I think the variables would have to be catered to the location, because it's not always going to be, it might be college education, it might be race, it might be income. But what I found through my study was that going into it, I thought that income would be one of the strongest variables, where in all actuality, it turned out that education level ended up being a stronger variable, at least with the clustering analysis. So I hope that answers both questions.
Okay, well, it looks like, yeah, great. It looks like that might be all the questions for now. And if anybody has any questions for you, I'm assuming they can email you afterwards, Rob.
Of course.
Great.
I can post my email in the chat room.
Great. Thanks very much. And if you want to stop sharing, Kendall can start sharing. Okay, we can see that, Kendall. So Kendall's going to present on critiquing tax-based land use models in small cities. And whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and start.
Well, thank you. My name is Kendall Hillis, and my advisor is Stephen Meinzer. Thank you for attending today. The name of my capstone project is Critiquing Tax-Based Land Use Models in Small Cities, a GIS-based inquiry in Eagan, Minnesota. A quote that I liked that I found when doing research was, "You get what you tax for." I think that's an accurate assessment of how cities are developed, and I think it does contribute greatly to, I guess, the development patterns of cities. I live in Eagan, Minnesota. Eagan is a southern suburb of the Twin Cities. The city was mostly farmland until it was incorporated in 1972. It was established as a kind of a bedroom community with residents commuting to Minneapolis or St. Paul. Like many suburbs that were established after World War II, development was based primarily in a kind of a suburban development pattern with curvy roads and cul-de-sacs rather than a gridded street system with incremental growth. It is now the 11th largest city in Minnesota. Eagan has many characteristics of the typical suburban development pattern. There's some inherent challenges with the post World War II development pattern. Predominantly, there's usually a predominance of single family housing. Similar land values are often, there's usually similar land values across the entire city. That's usually due to not having a central core. And often this requires continuous growth to sustain and pay for long-term maintenance efforts. Improvement to land ratio is a good metric to assess the housing stock and the stage of the life cycle a city is in. So improvement to land ratio, this is a measurement of the structures on land compared to the value of the land it sits on. This often indicates redevelopment potential. So for example, like a $750,000 building on a $250,000 piece of land would have a improvement to land ratio value of 3 to 1. Older homes on big lots are often candidates for redevelopment. When land values do not appreciate and improvements decline, there is no natural redevelopment pressure. And with no natural city center and quick outward growth, land values often flatline. So this is a map of the land value per acre in Eagan. There's actually, I noticed that there's not a lot of patterns with the land values in Eagan. That's kind of typical of a suburban development. But the one thing I did notice was there's an area of Eagan that this area right here actually, the areas in the red are actually in a different school district than these in the orange, or at least this like southern half. So in general, the land values seem to be pretty consistent kind of across the board. But I think school districts is one of the probably the most significant factors in affecting land value. Also, the age of the housing stock in Egan is relatively, it was developed primarily after World War II. As you can kind of see, this western portion of the city is much older. The eastern side of the city has some newer homes, and this kind of, you can kind of see this in the symbology right here. Last year, Egan completed its 2040 comprehensive plan. Some notable takeaways from the plan are that Egan is now nearly fully developed. Over half of its housing stock is single family, and 28% of the land is dedicated to low density use. Some key takeaways from the plan are that the goals of the plan are to create housing near points of interest, create more mixed land use, more density, and redevelopment. So I guess the purpose of my project was to figure out what land has potential for development or redevelopment, and what I sought to do was create a buildable lands inventory, and a buildable lands inventory identifies all land suitable for development, and this will help assess building capacity in the future and help meet the goals of the 2040 comprehensive plan. And this GIS approach has been used in many cities in Washington and Oregon. Most of the data used for this project was from the Dakota County Assessor's Office, and also there's some resources from the city of Egan, including correspondence with city staff. So the first part in developing a buildable lands inventory was developing the criteria for vacant, partially vacant, redevelopable, and accessory dwelling unit candidate parcels. So typically a vacant property is defined as properties with no structures or with very low value improvements. Partially vacant would be properties that are occupied by use but have enough land to be subdivided without the need for rezoning. Redevelopable are these are those properties with low improvement to land ratios, and this indicates potential for future redevelopment. And then this was something I was just interested in personally. There are properties in Egan that are eligible for are candidates for adding accessory dwelling units. What this means is that they can add what they call a granny flat based on a certain, they meet minimum requirements, and Egan has kind of outlined those requirements in their zoning code, and this has to be in a state or R1 zoning. So I created a model that allows the user to have to kind of define the parameters for each of these classifications based on a lot of trial and error and kind of cleaning up the data. I developed this model and these parameters for each of the classifications. Some of these queries or these some of these expressions are somewhat might be kind of vague or they might be a little unfamiliar just because you haven't seen the data. But just for example, vacant was all buildings that are less than that have less than estimated market value of 10,000, and then also tax exempt, and then over a certain size. So there's the results for vacant land. You can kind of see this is mostly, the result is mostly low density residential. I pull up the legend here. Yeah, most of the opportunities for I guess development in vacant lands are these little white areas, which are that's usually R1 zoning. Some of these bigger areas are planned development areas, and some of them aren't actually even able to be developed because there might be a body of water there. This area in the northeast corner of the city is actually being developed right now, so that kind of indicated that the tool was effective in finding vacant properties. Again, partially vacant land. This is mostly, these are lands that are not that can be subdivided potentially for other purposes, or it could be subdivided into can add another house or other type of structure. And again, these are mostly low density residential. So the redevelopable land was, I think, produced the best results. There's a lot of retail and different types of uses that have those low improvement to land ratio values, and this indicates that these properties could be redeveloped and could have more intense uses, and then also be more financially productive. And again, many properties are accessory dwelling unit candidates, which indicates that they have large lots, so small building footprint, so they do qualify for an accessory dwelling unit. But I think that will be well into the future until that's like a normal thing, if that actually does even happen. So there's one property I wanted to look at that caught my attention, was Egan Town Center. This was a redevelopable property. I always kind of laugh at how big the parking lot is for Walmart and Kohl's, and this is again, this is something that this is a property that I figured would probably be classified as redevelopable, and I'm glad the tool worked out. So what I wanted to do, this is kind of the second part of my project, was I wanted to figure out if you taxed, instead of a single rate property tax, which taxes the values of the combined value of the land and improvements, if you just tax the land, which is a land value tax. This is a hypothetical land value tax district, which has been used in Pennsylvania and other states. It's actually not even legal in Minnesota and many states. I just wanted to see what would be the implications of a land value tax, and if only the land is taxed, what properties are affected the most? So who is benefiting from the single rate property tax? So this is with a single rate property tax. you can see that there's some of these areas up here. Their tax burden is actually quite low, but then when you have a land value tax, more of their improvements in land are taxed because they're not utilizing the land efficiently. So this would be something I'd love to do on a large scale, but it gets a little complicated on a larger scale. But this is, I think, a good representation of how I guess the taxation structure kind of provides incentives for disincentives and incentives for the way that property is developed. So I guess in conclusion, I dealt with a lot of data, and it actually, there are no strong indications of redevelopment potential on older properties, and there's a lot of, because of there's just a suburban development pattern, there aren't a lot of it doesn't follow the traditional, the conclusions were not as definitive as I was expecting, but I think that's just an indication that the development pattern is kind of suburban, and land values are kind of spread across the board. Again, there are no tax advantages or incentives to using land to its highest potential. Like I said, there are few observable patterns for land values. School districts may be the only significant factor. Future development will primarily occur through subdividing and redevelopment rather than infill, and more density and population growth will occur near existing commercial centers because the existing residential, low density residential will not, it's not zoned for more intense uses. So with that, can I answer any questions?
Nice job, Kendall. Oh, there's some questions coming in already. If you can't see the chat, Kendall, you might need to stop sharing.
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, did you do any ground truthing to validate the classification of parcels into different land categories? That's a good question. In the examples in Oregon and Minnesota, Oregon and Washington, they did use a lot of the work was using kind of imagery, and then also actually going out there in person and checking for to make sure like the classifications were correct. That's not something, that's not something I did, but it was actually pretty satisfying because they're, especially for some of those older properties, they might be sitting on like a 3-acre piece of land, and the home was built in 1950. So the improvement to land ratio is actually very low, and it's like sitting in the middle of like maybe like it's surrounded by newer homes, so that indicated to me that there was I guess some accuracy in the tool. There's like hundreds of results, and I'd like to kind of, before I complete the paper, I'd like to go through and kind of check on those, but I did, in general, I did kind of check for some accuracy just by using imagery and then looking at like, realtor.com and stuff. And one question from Steven. What do you think is the value of having your defined thresholds in your BLI models variables? Yeah, that's a good point. By allowing the user, I guess, the ability to adjust the parameters based on their own, I guess they're both their own experiences, and then potentially based on I guess changing factors, and then kind of maybe even a better understanding the data. I think, yeah, having the flexibility to change the parameters and potentially even using this in another city in Dakota County, I think that's pretty helpful. But yeah, again, there is some of the parameters were based on some of those cases from Oregon and Washington, but I think I determined that I think that Egan kind of had its own set of circumstances that required their own parameters. So I kind of just used best judgment with many of the parameters, and I think it turned out pretty well.
Great. Well, we are right on time. So maybe you can also put your email address in the chat, Kendall, in case anybody has any more questions.
Thank you.
Oh, and there's one there. Maybe you can answer it in the chat like Rob did, so we can stay on track with time here. So the next presenter is Sean McMullen. He's going to present remotely piloted aircraft virtual reality mission planner. So Sean, whenever you go ahead and share and start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Okay, can you see the title page?
Yes, we can.
All right. Good afternoon, my name is Sean McMullen, and thank you for attending my capstone presentation, Remotely Piloted Aircraft Virtual Reality Mission Planner. I'd like to thank my advisor, Dr. Sajati, for guiding and assisting me through this process. The purpose of this project is to develop and later evaluate a 3D virtual reality mission planner application for remotely piloted aircraft, or RPA. This application aims to narrow the human-machine divide inherent in flight operations and better prepare RPA flight crews for geographically separated flight operations. This research aims to support two hypotheses. The first, a VR mission planning application will improve the flight planning process by adding a new tool for mission rehearsal and identifying aircraft positioning constraints due to environmental factors. And two, an RPA crew using the VR mission planner application will demonstrate increased spatial and situational awareness over a crew that does not, due to the improvements in visualization and game perspective. In this presentation, I'll cover my experience, background information, project goals and objectives, development of my VR mission planner, the planned evaluation and discussion. A little bit about me. I have 16 years of experience in aviation, flight instruction, and unmanned aircraft system design engineering. Now let's go over some basic RPA terminology, define the purpose, and cover some previous research. An RPA is part of an unmanned aircraft system that comprises both a ground element and an air element. The RPA can be large or small, fixed wing or rotary, jet turbine or propeller powered, depending on the mission it is designed to do. Typical RPA crews consist of a pilot and sensor operator. The pilot's responsibility is mission management, aircraft operation, communication, and overall authority on the crew. The sensor operator's responsibility is the operation of the aircraft's multispectral targeting system, or the camera, imagery collection, organization, and situational awareness of the mission environment, and serving as a co-pilot in many respects. Large RPAs are typically flown in a geographically separated environment from the aircrew in a concept known as remote split operations. One crew will take off and land the aircraft, while another geographically separated crew will fly the aircraft during the mission until it is time to land. The technological and physical divides inherent in RPA operations include geographic separation of the flight crew from the aircraft, non-standard equipment, the lack of vestibular, stereo-optical visual inputs, and other natural external sensory feedback. All these issues mentioned are just a few of the constraints placed on RPA flight crews to perform a mission as effectively as a manned aircraft physically flying in the mission environment. Previous research in VR learning has shown increased human performance and cognitive benefits, adding support for the study's hypotheses. Factors that contribute to a user's performance include telepresence, or the feeling of being there, decreased cognitive load, and improvements in spatial ability. Flight planning is traditionally done with 2D paper products or computer displays of 2D charts or representations. Topographical maps and aeronautical charts depict the terrain as a flat graphic representation of the Earth. Here we see the airspace surrounding Denver and the Rocky Mountains. This 2D graphic has a lot of 3D information presented as elevation figures and geometric shapes, which takes skill to decode. The intention of the VR mission planner is to take the information presented in the traditional 2D mission planning process and insert it into a 3D VR environment that the RPA crew can explore using 6 degrees of freedom. The VR mission planner allows the crew to experience the actual terrain relief, environmental factors, and visualize the mission with the help of geographic overlays as the aircraft might encounter it in the mission environment. This added perspective could theoretically lead to better performance of the flight crew and improved spatial awareness. One striking benefit of visualizing a mission plan in VR is the ability to rehearse the mission and approach problems creatively. On a mission designed to surveil a target of interest, a pilot is manually maneuvering an aircraft to avoid masking the aircraft's camera system from terrain or other opaque objects. All the while, the sensor operator is continually manipulating a camera ball mounted to the bottom of the aircraft along 2 axes as the aircraft is pitching and rolling. In this animation, the white circle is the point of rotation for the camera orbit. The target compound is located behind the terrain, but is obscured for 20 seconds with the aircraft holding in this position. The effect of the environmental masking cannot be mitigated entirely from looking at a topographical representation of the objective area. The ability to manipulate an egocentric camera perspective in 6 degrees of motion means the ability to determine sectors of the objective area that are beneficial to hold the aircraft over, or conversely, sectors to avoid. The performance of the flight crew in this scenario is ultimately based on their spatial awareness of the operational area. Goals and objectives. This study investigates new technologies for RPA flight planning, how the new technology affects the RPA crew's mission planning of a geographically separated environment, and evaluates the spatial and situational awareness performance of an RPA crew using the technology versus a control group. The objectives of this application are to improve 2 aviation processes. First, the RPA mission planning process with the addition of the VR mission planner application to the traditional paper document or 2D computer mission planning process. And secondly, to provide RPA crews with an increased level of spatial and situational awareness of the mission scenario and mission environment. This will be accomplished by evaluating 3 performance objectives derived from an RPA training syllabus: flight planning, situational awareness, and spatial awareness. To facilitate this research, in addition to developing a VR environment for RPA crews to mission plan, an RPA simulator mission designed to test human performance in spatial and situational awareness will be developed. Finally, design of an evaluation system will be required to collect and analyze the data. Now I'll go over my VR mission planner development and demonstration. The initial challenge of developing a VR mission planning environment was the selection of the hardware and software. This includes the VR interfacing hardware system, the VR development platform, and software for terrain generation or other GIS cartographic requirements. The VR interface would be an Oculus Rift head-mounted display and hand controls, as it was already available and purchased. The benchmark chosen for aesthetic appeal and functionality is Google Earth VR for the Oculus Rift. One of the primary requirements for the VR mission planner was low cost. Unity 3D game engine was an attractive choice, both because it was free to use and offered built-in functionality to develop VR for the Oculus Rift. Unity, however, does not readily come with SDKs for GIS cartographic applications. Key factors when choosing a GIS SDK were the ability to import common geographic files such as KMLs, realistic 3D terrain modeling of actual locations on Earth, cost, and ease of use. I evaluated several SDKs for building the terrain in the VR environment. World Composer met the most key factors and was chosen for the study. The only factor not met was the ability to import KMLs, so the overlays would need to be drawn manually. The World Composer SDK uses the Bing Maps API to generate imagery and height maps. Users can determine terrain area, height map, and image resolution, and also correct the imagery for shadows. I used overlapping imagery and height map layers of decreasing size and increasing resolution to build a large mission planning environment. The largest layer of the lowest imagery resolution zoom layer provided a vast blanket landscape at 32 by 32 kilometers, while the smallest layers provided the highest image resolution. Once the terrain was built, geographic overlays and annotations were drawn in Unity to label points of interest and areas of concern to the mission. The locomotion controls of Google Earth VR are intuitive and allow the user 6 degrees of freedom, and was the benchmark for this application. Virtual Reality Toolkit, an application created by Extended Reality, was chosen as an easy-to-use locomotion and camera control SDK for Unity with support for Oculus Rift. Of particular interest for this VR mission planner was an accurate representation of altitude. Avoidance of terrain obstruction can only be mitigated by planning flight altitudes accurately. A camera-centric menu was created to allow the user to select the desired altitude with the hand controller laser pointer. I'd like to present a short demo of my VR mission planner. Gripping the controller allows the user to move forwards, backwards, right, left, and down and up. Pulling the trigger allows the user to roll left and right along the y-axis. And the headset itself allows the user to look around in any direction. Moving into the village, we see a column of restricted airspace that the crew will need to stay out of. This would normally be depicted as a chart or as a flat circle on a chart. Detail and areas of interest are higher resolution than the larger environment. Text faces the camera, so to be seen from any perspective, and geomarkers identify key areas. The environment is fully immersive. Wearing the headset and traveling through the river valley makes you feel surrounded by the terrain. The ability to view the sky from the ground adds a unique perspective that aircrew do not typically experience. The user can be creative and explore any way they see fit to better meet the mission objectives. If we zoom out a bit, we can observe more functionality. The laser allows the user to point things out, such as the road in the valley, by resting their finger on the controller. The other function is to select altitudes on the menu. Hovering over an altitude highlights a button, and pressing down on the button selects the altitude. From 24,000 feet, you can see almost the entire road, and by dropping down 2,000 feet, you can see less of the road due to the terrain blocking the view. When an altitude is selected, the camera is locked on the Y plane, allowing movement in all directions except for up and down. Selecting the free button allows the user to move the camera in any direction again. The environment can be as large or as small as required to get the job done. Now my planned study. A heuristic pilot evaluation with one domain expert was performed with the final iteration of the VR Mission Planner application. The overall impression of the application was positive. With minimal instruction, the evaluator was able to explore the VR environment and immediately observe the practical application of the VR Mission Planner for flight operations. The planned study is designed to evaluate human subjects' performance in a complex ISR mission after utilizing the VR application to mission plan against a control group not using VR for mission planning. Randomly paired and assigned crews shall be given either the VR mission planner or traditional 2D mission planning products to prepare for the simulated ISR scenario conducted in Flight Simulator. The crews are to perform their planned mission and then debrief their performance against their mission plan. Crew's performance will be based on a graded rubric and standardized performance criteria adopted from an RPA training manual. Grading criteria was also adapted from research by Li, Wang, and Feng, in which they measured the psychological factors that affected learning outcomes in desktop VR learning. Those 4 factors chosen are based on spatial and situational awareness related performance criteria and were representational fidelity, perceived usefulness, presence, and cognitive benefits. In order to fully validate the application, the results of the experiment will be required. Initial observations of the VR mission planner in its final stage of development show an immediate benefit to improve the RPA crew's understanding of the mission environment. Spatial orientation takes just a few seconds. Controls are smooth and intuitive. The application works well as a means to explore an environment in a 3D space and provide some reference to physical and notional boundaries that the air crew would be challenged against. And no discussion of military tactics would be without a quote from Sun Tzu: "Confirmation of the ground is of the greatest assistance in battle." In summary, I discussed the challenges of flying and mission planning from 2D sources and covered the development and planned evaluation of my VR mission planner application for RPA aircrew. I'm looking forward to applying my degree and other meaningful pursuits. I want to thank all my professors for passing on their knowledge and experience. Thank you for your attention, and I'll take any questions.
Great job, Sean. Looks like there's already a question.
Okay. See, Robert said, great work. Demo was impressive. In addition to VR, do you see the utilization of AI machine learning being beneficial towards mission planning? Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see that playing a role. I mean, I don't have any intention on bringing that into my sort of, very rudimentary kind of process, but as far as like maybe automating some of the flight planning routes and things like that, I can see that being utilized. Ashley Olson says, is it possible for an instructor to record an ideal mission profile in the VR environment for students to watch as a demo rather than the crew exploring on their own? Yeah, that demonstration was just a video that I took. So if an instructor wants to record their own thing, then that could definitely be utilized for that. Mission reversal, mission instruction, those sort of things could definitely be used, could be done.
Okay, great. Well, I guess I would recommend you do the same thing as the first couple presenters, Sean, and put your email address down in there, and maybe another question or two will come in.
Yeah, we'll do.
Okay, so our next presenter is Boyang Wang, and the title is Parkware, Designing a Mobile Application for Finding and Reporting Available Street Parking Spots. So Boyang, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Boyang, and my capstone project is designing a mobile parking application called Parkware to find available street parking spots using volunteered geographic information. I have used different parking applications for many years, but none of them can answer all my questions I have when I look for street parking regarding the spot's availability, location, type, permit or license requirement, size, and if it is metered or not. These existing technologies are able to detect the exact location of available spots or the probability of having an available spot in certain areas, but their detections are all missing some important information such as license or permit requirement and the spot size. There are also existing mobile applications that show the parking routes, but they cannot determine the exact location of available parking spots, meaning that the app users still need to drive around to find one. In my research, there was one application that did report the spot location by asking the user to report to the app when they saw available spots, but the users had little incentive to do that. And the app didn't report anything else other than the spot location. This is why the app is now defunct. So Parkware needs to retrieve all the information listed here to make it both functional and user-friendly. I spent a few months designing the user interface and interaction that allows Parkware to collect all the data it needs to answer all these questions. Then I developed an interactive web mockup to present the design so that it can be evaluated by the potential end users. Let's now take a look at this mockup, which I developed using ArcGIS JavaScript API for the maps and a CSS framework called Bootstrap for the layout. The first thing you see on this mockup is an introduction to the two use cases. The first user cannot find an available spot on Parkware, which is the most often case if there are not many available spots on the map. This user then needs to drive around to find one. Let's first see the use case of this user. The simulation of the user movement is achieved by controlling the flowchart on the left. At the beginning, the first user drives around until an available spot is found. When the user stops at the spot, a checking button appears. And the user clicks on the button, and the app asks the user to confirm if the spot is legal by answering these questions. And the answers will be recorded in the app to be reported to the other users when this spot becomes available. After checking, we can see a spot created as an orange dot on this user's map. This can work as a parked car reminder so that while the user is away from the car, this button will help the user to find where the parking location is. When the user returns to the car, a checkout button becomes available for the user to tell the app that he or she is ready to pull out. This spot then becomes available to the other users who drive cars that are in same or smaller sizes. This can be determined by comparing the user profile when setting up the account to use the app. Let's now assume the second user does drive a smaller car. So the dot becomes visible on the second user's map and is now in green, indicating that it's now an available spot. The second user can click on the spot to view the information provided by the first user. And then this second user can drive directly to the spot since it's available. And when the user arrives, the same checking button appears. Let me move my chat window a little bit. Okay, so the checking button appears, and there's a new button called report unavailable. This is for the user to report a spot if the user finds that the spot is actually unavailable for any reason, such as being occupied by someone else, or if the information provided by the first user is wrong. Then this user can use this button to tell the app to remove this spot. So if the spot is available, the user clicks on checking and confirms or edits any information provided by the first user. This makes the spot occupied, so it is removed from other users' maps. And on this user's map, it turns orange as the parked car location. Or if the spot is not available, the user clicks on the report button, and this time it is removed on both maps. These two use cases explain how the spots are populated and updated according to the user volunteered input. The next step of the project is to have potential users evaluate the design of Parkware. I created a survey and distributed on Amazon Mechanical Turk. This platform has more than 200,000 users, with most of them from America, that are hired to complete all kinds of tasks, including evaluation service like this. This can make sure that parkware mockup can be evaluated by users with different living backgrounds and parking experiences. My survey was constructed in 3 sections. First is regarding their parking experiences, such as where they live and where they find most difficult to park. Second is regarding their familiarities with existing parking applications, such as if they have heard one, or if they have used one, and why yes and why not. Third is regarding their feedback on parkware design based on the mockup user experience. Here they can criticize any design pitfalls and provide suggestions for improvement. This survey was approved by Penn State Institutional Review Board on March 12, and it was distributed on March 18. I received 20 valid responses on the same day. And let's take a look now at my findings. The first finding is that most respondents consider that it is most difficult to park when going to shopping, dining, socializing, and recreational activities, rather than parking at home, at work, or at school. When they are asked to describe how they park in each of these locations, I find out that most respondents consider a place difficult to park if there is no reserved parking at that place. While many respondents have like a private garage at home or parking lots at workplace or school, they mostly have to look for street parking, whether metered or not, at shopping, dining, social, and recreational places. This reflects the need to design a parking app to focus on street parking like parkware. The second finding is that the respondents who live in smaller communities are less familiar with parking applications than those who live in big city urban centers. Here you can see that only 20% of the respondents who live in smaller communities are familiar with parking applications. However, after reviewing parkware mockup, 70% of those respondents who live in smaller communities and have not heard of parking apps found that an app like parkware can actually be helpful in their lives. This result surprised me a lot, and it indicates that parkware as a crowdsourcing parking application can be launched in smaller communities to attract more users. The third finding is the features in a parking app that is considered the most helpful. Here you can see the most respondents voted viewing parking spots location and availability as the most useful feature. This is the basis of parkware design. In addition to this core functionality, parkware also provided other features that are considered useful, including viewing the permit license and meter information, and locating the user's parked vehicle. As the feedback on parkware design, the respondents gave it a rating of 4.01 out of 5 in its usefulness, and 85% of the respondents would like to recommend it to others. The respondents suggested several areas of improvements. One is visualizing the spots. If there are a lot of spots in a small area, it can be technically difficult and visually distracting to draw all of them on the map. A solution is to use clusters at small scales to show the total number of spots at certain areas and only draw the individual spots when the map is zoomed in to a large scale. This is an example of existing location-based application that used this kind of visualization method. Other suggestions are regarding the additional features that can be added, such as navigating to the nearest available spot, push or sound alert for a new spot nearby, and reserving a spot, which requires integration with the existing parking meter system. There are other concerns that will determine the success of parkware. First is the signal quality of GPS and cellular data. I found that GPS area in some cities can be as large as 200 feet. This distance is longer than many street parking spots adding together, making it impossible to determine exact spot location just based on the GPS. So the app should then allow the user to pan the map to correct the positioning. In terms of cellular data, it is a challenge in every mobile application, and it is more of a development issue rather than a design issue. I think the key here is to simulate weak signals when developing the app in a mobile environment to test the speed and the stability. Second is developing a large user base. A strategy is to first launch this app in smaller communities so that it will have a relatively large number of users in a small area. This will make Parkware more useful than launching it in a large city with a relatively small number of users. Third is the escalation of cost with increasing numbers of users that will become a financial challenge in the long run. As you can see from this diagram, the cost to use a commercial API for just the database will increase in almost linearly or with the increase in number of users. This suggests that the development of Parkware should consider using free and open source solutions to reduce cost, and also exploring the ways to make profits, such as charging subscription fees for some premium features, or integrating with city meter parking systems and charging commission fees. While cost is not initially a concern, the developers need to consider how to make Parkware scalable so that after a few years, it can be launched in multiple cities, whether large or small, with more users to make it more useful. That's all about my capstone project. Any questions?
Hi, Boyang. Can you show the demo again?
Yes.
We weren't able to see that, the mock-up.
So can you see the browser that I have opened?
Right now, we see the question slide. So you might.
So you should only see the PowerPoint. I'm sorry, I didn't know that.
That's okay. Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt you.
Let me see how I can share my whole screen other than the PowerPoint.
You might need to stop sharing what you're doing now. Yeah. And then,
you see it now?
Yeah, now we can see it.
Okay, so I'll just go through it very quickly.
Great.
First, the user just cruise around the street to find a spot, and when he found one, the user can put some information and then submit it, and then this become a parking spot. I mean, that is occupied by this user. Then this user walks away to go to some final destination, and then the user returns. And then the checkout button becomes available. And this becomes available spot to and can be shown on the other maps, other users' phones. So this user now drives away, and the other user can click on the spot information to see if it can fit in their vehicle, and then just drive directly to the available spot. And after the second user arrives, the same checking button will become available, and there will also be the report unavailable button. So if you click on this one, the checking, then this becomes occupied again. I mean, this user can check the information input by the first user, and it become a parked spot, parked location. And if you click, and if this user clicks on the report unavailable, then the dot will disappear on both maps. Okay, that's about all about my mockup.
Great, thank you. You already have a question. You could just stop sharing, you should be able to see it.
Okay, let me turn on my chat room. So the question from Anthony is, Given the trend for vehicles to more tightly integrate phone operating systems, Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, what do you think might need to change about your interface system to potentially take advantage of that kind of integration? That's a great question. My car has Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, depending on if I'm using an Android phone or iPhone. Like it shows navigation system and multimedia playing, like all integrated in my dashboard, and that is something that I believe that it can be a great platform to have this Parkware app to be displayed, because this app is essential a navigating app as well. So after you see the spot, the next thing you do is to just drive there, and you will need to see that the location of the spot at all times. So navigation can be integrated in the app to just direct the driver to find the route to the spot. And if it can be displayed on the dashboard instead of on just a phone screen, I believe it will have a larger map that will make the navigation easier. And the other question, I guess, is the similar. So yeah, so I do believe that having this app developed for that kind of dashboard system in the car can be a great start point.
Did you see Sean's question about smart parking meters?
Oh, the smart parking meters question. Yes, Sean asked if the smart parking meters can be integrated in the system. So this is something that some other apps have been doing by having the city meters number integrated in the system. So the users can just type in the parking meter number and pay on their phone. And I believe those apps charge a commission fee so that they can maintain the system while the city benefits from more people paying the meters conveniently on their phone. And I believe that this can be additional feature added to my Parkware, and it can be a way to make profit.
Great job, Boyong. If maybe you could also put your email address in the chat. I think everybody so far has gotten a question afterwards, because I think some people are still typing. So if you're
okay, sure.
Yeah, great. Great job. Okay, and we have one more presenter today, Glenn Xavier. Boyong, if you can stop sharing, then Glenn can share his screen. Glenn is going to talk about a comparative assessment of computer vision-based tree crown detection and segmentation models in mixed-use land cover at USAF installations. So whenever you're ready, Glenn.
Okay, can you guys hear me and see my screen?
Yep.
All right. Okay, my name is Glenn Xavier, and my capstone project proposal is to conduct a comparative assessment of computer vision-based tree crown detection and segmentation models, or convolutional neural networks, in mixed-use land cover at U.S. Air Force installations. My advisor is Dr. Douglas Miller. So when I first started this project, I was working as an environmental analyst for Colorado State University within a research organization called the Center for Environmental Management of Military Lands, or CEML. CEML is contracted by DoD for a lot of different environmental services and range management. In January, however, I joined a DoD support agency here in St. Louis. In this presentation, I'll cover our problem and background, outline my project goals and objectives, discuss the study areas we'll be working with and the data sources we have for them. I will give you a quick brief on how computer vision, object detection, and convolutional neural networks operate, and then I'll go into more detail on our overall workflow and the several methods we implemented. I will then present our preliminary results and discuss future research goals. So my project attempted to implement a workflow to both detect trees and segment out individual tree crown at U.S. Air Force installations. Federal law requires that the DoD maintain and protect the natural and cultural resources of their properties, and Air Force installations are generally small, self-contained cities that combine a mix of urban, suburban, and natural land cover. Each base makes an attempt to protect endangered species, natural habitats, and the surrounding ecosystem. Urban beautification is also a major motivation, and bases spend a lot of time and money planting and maintaining tree-lined streets. Most bases have been directed to manage an urban tree inventory containing the point locations of all their trees, along with attributes on size, height, and overall health. Maintaining these inventories is labor-intensive and sporadic, so we were hoping to look at automated solutions. Remote sensing data is definitely an option to supplement labor-intensive surveys, and most literature suggests that LiDAR collected with at least 4 pulses per square meter is suitable for the extraction of individual tree metrics. You can measure out individual tree height without much work, but you definitely need to segment out individual trees first in order to measure crown width and height. Fortunately, the Air Force collects high-resolution imagery and LiDAR for each of their installations every few years, and the resolution and density continues to improve. Unfortunately, most of this great data go unused due to a lack of institutional knowledge on how to process it. The contractor does deliver some LiDAR-derived products like DEMs and height models, and combined with imagery, that is generally all that people use. So the methods we chose to investigate for this project fall under the large categories of computer vision and object detection and recognition. We use convolutional neural networks, or CNNs, which are a form of deep learning, which itself is a subset of machine learning and artificial intelligence. This is far different from many feature extraction approaches, but this is where the state of the art is for a lot of image processing. Many of the larger concepts should be familiar to you if you've ever created a land cover map using a maximum likelihood or unsupervised isocluster technique. Much of the workflow is the same, as you are required to train samples and use a lot of fine-tuning of parameterization. As shown on the right, object detection methods can classify an image and then can detect where it is in the image by placing a bounding box and/or a mask. You can also train the model to detect multiple classes and further segment between them. The main problem with computer vision methods is that CNNs and other machine learning and deep learning models require a significant number of training samples, and the computational expense to get decent accuracy is pretty high. While there are existing models and imagery libraries that we are able to use, decent results tend to require our own training. CNNs are also typically limited to 3-band imagery, which is a major drawback compared to pixel-based techniques where you can easily incorporate multi- or hyperspectral data. This limitation is again due to computational expense, as adding more than 3 dimensions to the network would essentially require supercomputers. Almost all convolutional neural networks are limited to 3 bands, but the novel part of our project gets around this limitation by using a customized imagery stack that incorporates the spectral information we're interested in, as well as terrain. So we have 4 concrete goals for this project. The first objective is to detect trees from imagery using several different computer vision object detection models. We did this using both your standard 3-band RGB imagery and our own novel solution incorporating fused imagery utilizing elevation data. We then compared the best models against our prior work utilizing traditional object-based feature extraction and watershed segmentation algorithms. We measured and reported the accuracy of these methods, and in the near future, we will provide a recommendation back to CSU and AFCEC for further refinement and implementation. So for this project, we have identified a handful of potential installations that have high-resolution imagery and dense LiDAR. These were picked due to their variation in tree species, land cover, and other unique aspects of their terrain, and availability of reference and validation data. Other bases were available for model validation or additional training. This table summarizes the 4-band imagery and LiDAR we have for our 5 bases. Each one is a bit different. The overall resolution is about the same, which is important for a convolutional neural network. The imagery is pretty close to a true ortho, although there is some building and vegetation lean depending on where the seam is. Some bases are in leaf-off conditions and tree types vary by region. All bases have LiDAR datasets that were captured at the same time. All of our approaches use deep learning and computer vision with a convolutional neural network. On your left is an example of image processing using a kernel filter or a convolutional filter. This should be familiar to you if you've applied a Sobel filter to an image to enhance lines or a Gaussian filter to smooth out an image. Each pixel from the source image that falls within the kernel window is transformed by a set value, and the window slides through the image to change all the pixels in the image. In a neural network, however, the kernel filter values are learned over time, changing slightly each epoch or each generation. As the image is fed into the convolutional layer, a number of randomly initialized kernel filters will pass over the image. These results are then fed into the next layer, and these are matched or tested against the validation data set. Over time, the filters that give us the best matching results will be learned by the network. Convolutional neural networks usually have additional convolutions performed sequentially in a defined number of hidden layers. Each hidden layer will increase the number of convolutions by subsampling from the preceding layer, performing additional convolutions on smaller and smaller patches with smaller and smaller kernels. Neural networks are often dozens of layers deep and are combined with additional tricks like up and down sampling of the image to detect objects at different scales. The matching images for a complex network are largely unrecognizable to humans, but that doesn't matter. So we tested over 4 CNN implementations on 2 versions of our data sets. Due to the 3-band limitation, we stripped out the near infrared and created a traditional RGB image and ran it through all the models. Our attempt at a novel approach used a 3-band image containing NDVI, a panchromatic band, and a digital height model, which I will discuss further on the next slide. The steps for all the models were the same. Training samples were used to extract image chips that are used to train the model. Depending on the algorithm, the training samples would have to be extracted to different formats, but the training set always remained the same. The model was then applied to the image. If necessary, the model was supplemented with additional samples. The overall model was then validated against 2 regions we delineated as urban and unmanaged forests. We reported average intersection over union for all bases within both delineations. For our preliminary results, we used deep forest, which has come pre-trained with thousands of images of trees collected from the NEON data set at a 10 centimeter resolution, which is slightly coarser than ours, which are around 6 to 7.5 centimeters. The NEON data set does not have much urban clutter, which is a big difference from ours because we are in an Air Force installation. So we can expect it to potentially misclassify buildings. Since this came pre-trained, we only applied this to our RGB images. YOLO V3, or You Only Look Once V3, Faster RCNN, and Mask RCNN were all available in ArcPro and Python, and we applied them to both images. Mask RCNN uses an implementation of Faster RCNN, but also masks out or segments out individual objects. So we created a regular RGB image to apply the models to, but that lacks near infrared and completely ignores elevation data we collected from LiDAR. In order to capture spectral information from near and additional terrain details, we implemented a fused image stack containing 3 bands. 1 band is our normalized difference vegetation index, or NDVI, generated from the near and red bands of the source imagery. The second band is a panchromatic image generated by averaging the red, green, and blue bands. The third band is created from our LiDAR point cloud and is a digital height model, or normalized digitalized surface model. This was created by subtracting a DEM from the DSM to get a raster containing only height values of elevated objects. The objective here is to potentially capture the pseudo 3D shape of a tree crown canopy to aid in detection and segmentation. Both the NDVI and DHM were transformed to an 8-bit unsigned raster, and then all 3 bands were combined into a single image, as seen on the right. It definitely looks ugly, but remember that only a computer needs to interpret it. You can still see that with this band combination, trees tend to pop out as bright magenta, as the height model is in the red channel, and NDVI is in the blue channel. Most buildings appear brown with the exception of a few dark buildings. Grasses and bushes are blue, and impermeable surfaces and soil are green. Once we had both images to use, we trained all our models using a sample of 1,200 hand-delineated trees at Scott. These were based on ground truth points and a visual examination of canopy dimensions in imagery and LiDAR. 10% of the samples were reserved for validation within each epoch. Training time would take up to 3 to 4 hours depending on the number of epochs we were using. At 50 epochs, YOLO V3 took a bit over 3 hours on our sample with a GTX 1080 Ti. Mask RCNN took a little bit longer due to the additional segmentation algorithms. It is worth noting that the learning rate tended to stop improving dramatically at around 20 epochs, so we can probably get away with less training. Once we had a model built on Scott's data, we trained the model with additional samples from 100 trees at the 4 other bases, one base at a time. We used 20 epochs for this, but it only takes a few minutes due to the low number of samples. After training and retraining, we applied the completed model to each image. This can take up to an hour for a large image, about 20 minutes per 2.5 squares kilometers. We used the same batch size and used a max overlap ratio of 0.3. This is known as non-maximum suppression, and as seen on the upper right, results in a union of bounding boxes if they overlap. This also causes some problems, since tree canopy will often naturally overlap, but we don't necessarily want them removed, as seen in the 3 detected horses below. After some experimentation, 0.3 was found to be a decent threshold, but more experimentation is needed, along with some parameterization of other model settings that influence this. Our final step in the process is an accuracy assessment, and we use the Jacquard index or intersection over union as our primary metric. This is one of the most commonly used metrics in computer vision, and anything over a value of 0.5 is considered adequate. However, there are other metrics like recall and precision that are now used because many object detection algorithms have reached the point where IOU values are all very high. Most of our best results were actually only within the 0.8 range, so IOU was a sufficient measurement for now. Here is a table of our very preliminary results, delineated by urban and unmanaged forest zones and averaged across 5 bases. Results were fair for the 3 models we trained ourselves, but still not sufficiently accurate enough to recommend adoption. In general, we are looking to be reliably above 80% in urban situations. Unmanaged forest will always be more rough, but we would like to see better numbers here. We also saw very little difference between RGB and fused image stack implementation. The big point of divergence between these two were false positives on bare earth and grass that the RGB image would pick up. Due to the inclusion of elevation, the fused image stack rarely had detections on low-lying bushes, grass, or textured soil. However, the fused image stack did occasionally detect trees on the roofs of buildings with high NDVI. Deep forest did not perform well even when supplemented with samples from our own images, although it is possible it simply needs additional training data. It is possible this is due to the difference in resolution and the fact that the model was trained on mostly model forests with very little in the way of buildings and roads. Unmanaged forest zone results were poor across the board, especially when there were leaf-off conditions or dead trees. This will need to be mitigated with additional classes, training samples, or a different method. Our full report will list all accuracy values, errors of omission and commission, as well as provide the methodology for zonal delineation. Here's an example of results from the urban section at Scott. You can see there's not much of a difference between RGB and fused YOLO implementations. Mask RCNN also had similar results, but the segmentation quality was definitely not as good as object-based or watershed approaches, most likely due to problems with the no max suppression values and detection of trees on the edges of chips. Here are a couple examples of results from Fairchild and Langley before and after retraining. On the left is the first Scott model applied to each base, and on the right is the same model retrained with the additional 100 samples from that specific base. Accuracy is significantly improved with just a handful of site-specific samples, although we will probably need to increase this number. So we do have quite a bit of work here before we can recommend a model for widespread adoption as a push-button process on datasets outside the training range. There are other models to try, starting with a single-shot detector, but in general, dialing in the appropriate parameters is a time-consuming process due to computational expense. The key parameter to look at for tree segmentation and an accurate tree count is probably the non-maximum suppression, since overlapping crowns will be eliminated if the threshold is too low. If it is too high, then you will get too many detections for one tree and have to do additional processing. We could also generate better and more training samples. However, this risks overtraining. Another option is to use multiple classes in order to better discriminate between tree types. I still believe that the fused image stack might be viable and a novel improvement over using just RGB. However, it is possible that using a slope of the DHM instead of raw height would eliminate problems with detections on buildings. This method was used in our prior research in an OBIA-based extraction, since it discriminates well between trees with high variability and buildings with uniform slopes. Ultimately, I remain confident that we can build a model that could be generalized across our urban landscape data sets, and as models improve, it should be easier to find something that will work under these conditions. And that concludes my presentation. Are there any questions?
Great job, Glenn. There's already a question.
Okay. How much time do you think you would need to finalize your methods for other applications? For other applications, well, it depends on what the other application is. If we're just detecting trees in other regions, non-bases or cities or out in rural areas, you wouldn't need a lot of time to retrain it for that specific data set. But if you wanted to take this model and then train something completely different, like utilities on the side of a building or swimming pools or something like that, then you would probably need to start from scratch. You could probably use the same model methodology, but they'd have to train everything yourself and go through the process and probably come up with your own parameters for it. So it really depends on what kind of application you have in mind. This is very practical application development. Could you see this tool being used to not only provide inventory of tree species on a given Air Force base, but also provide planting tree type for species, richness, habitat diversity, green space, et cetera, for a specific base? Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you could get the accuracy high enough, especially if you implement other classes, say discriminating between deciduous and conifers or live trees and dead trees, small trees, big trees, you could get a lot more data to populate your urban tree inventory, which you generally need to produce your natural resources management plan or things like that. Yeah, that's definitely the goal. If we can get better data and update it with just a push button every couple of years as we get new imagery and LiDAR data, then we can feed that into planning and management for urban trees.
Well, great job. It's pretty impressive that we finished exactly on time, given that there were 5 presentations. So thanks, Glenn, and thanks all of the other presenters, and thanks to everybody who came to watch them. I think at one point we were up to 22 participants, so that's great. So again, come back next Tuesday. We have 5 or 6 more next Tuesday, and then we have some next Thursday evening. So thanks everybody, and have a good rest of your day.